How about now? You want it left on?
All right, folks, it's 5 after, so we're fashionably late. So we're going to start studying in 1 John today, but we won't get into the text because I always have to do some background first, as you all know. Nathan, we're online now? Okay. I thought I'd mention to the folks who are hearing during streaming that we're sorry that we didn't have our streaming up last week. Apparently that is still going to be posted. Last week's Bible class is going to be posted on YouTube yet. But we finished Philemon last week. And for those of you who missed the class or didn't hear the streaming, Philemon finished happy. That's a nice thing. Apparently, Onesimus took the letter back to Philemon, and then, of course, the letter itself doesn't say what happened. How happy or sad or angry was Philemon when Onesimus showed up. But we do have kind of a hint, because in Colossians chapter 4, verse 7, 8, and 9, Paul is writing, and this is after the time of the writing of the book of Philemon, and he mentions that this Christian Tychicus was going to be going from Rome back to Colossae, and with him Onesimus. So Onesimus wasn't put to death or something by Philemon. Apparently, either Philemon let him go back to take care of Paul in Rome, or maybe Philemon set him free. But either way, things are good with Onesimus in the book of Colossians, which was written after Philemon. And we'll finish with that. So today, we're going to start talking about 1 John. And I mentioned when I started this thing that these are books that we never study. I asked how many folks had ever been in a class on Philemon 3 weeks ago, and I don't think anybody raised their hand. How many of you have ever been in a class on 1 John or heard a sermon on 1 John? Oh, okay, we got 1 or 2 or 3, yeah, all right. But not many. And so I got to thinking about, well, why? Why haven't we studied these books more? Let me say a few statements to you, and then we'll move on. Pretty much all of the New Testament was probably written before AD 70, except for 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, and Revelation. And maybe the Gospel of John. We really don't know when the Gospel of John was written. A lot of people want to say that the Gospel of John was written about AD 80, and maybe 1 John was written about AD 85, but we really don't know. Conservative folks believe that the other 3 Gospels were definitely written before AD 70, and maybe the Gospel of John was written before that, or maybe afterward. So there's not just a whole lot of the New Testament that was written before AD 70. And from AD 70 to the end of the first century, AD 70 to 100, there's no narrative in the New Testament of what's going on during that period of time. The book of Acts goes, for 28 chapters. We spent a year and a half studying the book of Acts. And the book of Acts ends somewhere around AD 60, 61. And so we have a sense of what's going on from the Gospels, the birth of Christ, through about AD 61. But from that time on, we don't really know, what was going on, but we have found out. In the years AD 70 to about AD 100, the church was there, and it was growing, but it was a lot of troubles in the church during that time. And who wants to hear about trouble? We like to hear good things and happy things, but it's more difficult when the church is facing problems. And there were not Christians writing outside of the Bible between AD 70 and 100 to speak of. Maybe one, but not much. And in the years after AD 100 to 200, there are a number of Christians who wrote outside of the Bible. But these were not happy times. And maybe that's why we haven't studied these books, because they're not talking about, good, happy things like we have in a good part of the rest of the Bible. And yet, when we talk about what these books are about, including 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Jude, the negative things, don't we need to hear about how Christians faced negative things? In 1st John, we're going to find that there's a couple of big problems. One of them is immorality, and one of them was false teaching. And 1st John and 2nd John, 3rd John, and Jude were written to Christians who were having to face those problems. Don't we have to face those same kind of problems today? And maybe we can learn from these about how to face the problems of immorality, how to face the problems of false teaching. And so, connected with that, I'm going to show you a thing that I hung up on the wall of my grandson Marlon's room. My grandson Marlon is 16. And about 3 years ago, he and I were talking, and he was talking about kids. And at the age of 13, he had a girlfriend that he thought he was going to get married. Anyone want to take a vote as to how that turned out? First of all, he was real surprised. He told me one time they were going to get married when they were 16, and I said, "No, you're not." And he said, "Why not?" And I said, "Because you're still minors, and I'm not going to agree to that." And he went, "Really?" He had no idea he had to be, like over 18 to get married in law, pretty much. And then he said something one time in this conversation about how that maybe he'd live with a girl, and after a while they'd get married if they wanted to. And I'd say, I need to talk to you about that too a little bit. I said, "Do you know that God doesn't want you to do that?" And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, God thinks that people ought to get married before they live together." And he said, "Really?" And he wasn't angry or defensive. He was surprised. And he said to me, "Gramps, I've never heard anyone say that before." He had never heard anyone, kids talking, or adults, he'd never heard anyone say, "Don't live together until you get married." So anyway, I put this up on his wall. And for those of you who can't read it, it says, education, work, marriage, children. It's been hanging on his wall for about 3 years. And one day we were talking about this. And I said, and the important thing about these 4 things is they are in this order. He went, "Oh, okay." And we've talked about this every once in a while. And I still think I did a good thing by hanging it on his wall, And then he surprised me a good deal. About a year and a half ago, he came home with a T-shirt that he had bought and paid for with his own money. And when you're 15, that's kind of a big deal right there. And on the T-shirt it said Virgin. And he wears it to school once in a while. And that surprised me. So one day I said, "Marlon, why do you wear that T-shirt that says Virgin to school?" He said, "Well, I made up my mind I'm going to stay a virgin until I get married." I said, "That's good." But you know what I'm talking about. How many times have we heard in church in the last 10 to 20 years that people shouldn't live together until they're married? And how many of some of our children, I might as well say some of my children, have done that very thing with the complications and problems that come from that? Just like my grandson saying at 13 he was going to marry this girl, and I knew that was never going to happen. And they did break up after about a year when he was 14, and they have not gotten back together since. So that to me is a something we can smile about as an illustration about how we're still facing some of the problems that people were facing in the first century concerning immorality. Are we facing any problems about false teaching today? Oh my goodness. We could talk the rest of the hour just about that, okay? But we're not going to do that. Okay, at any rate, a little more discussion about this period of time. We're going to talk a good deal about the years between AD 70 and AD 100, more or less. Why is AD 70 a big deal? Why is that date something that is like a turning point? What's so important about AD 70? When the temple, and not just the temple, was destroyed, but Jerusalem itself was destroyed. The walls around the city were torn down. And to what extent was the temple destroyed? That is, we're talking about a building made out of large blocks of stone and so forth. I'm sorry? Jesus had predicted that not one of these stones will be left on another. Now, if we talked about a brick building, and we have some brick, I guess, on this building somewhere, if we said something about not one brick would be left on each other, would anybody be impressed by that? No. But the temple was stones that were 6 feet long and 3 feet high and a couple of feet wide. These were very, very big, heavy stones that they built. And when the Roman army tore the temple down, they tore it down to the ground. All the stones were taken apart. Huh? You want to tell me? Yeah. Yeah. The war itself, AD 70, was not the end of the fighting. And by the way, who was doing the fighting? The Jews versus Romans. It was a war between the Jews and the Romans. The war wasn't just in AD 70. The war started in AD 66 and went to 73. It was a 7-year war. And the destruction of the temple in AD 70 was toward the end of it, but there was a lot before and a lot afterward. There wasn't just one battle. There were many battles. In fact, Jerusalem was the largest city that the Romans destroyed during the war, but there was a lot of battles of smaller cities north of Jerusalem. But even after Jerusalem, there were 3 citadels, forts, fortified places that were battles after the destruction of Jerusalem. And the very last one of them has become famous. Anybody know the name of the last place that the Romans fought against? Masada, yeah. And what's so big about Masada, besides being the last one? They shut themselves in, but, all cities had walls shut themselves in. What was more significant about this place? And when the Romans finally were able to get to the gate and set the gate on fire because it was wood, the Jews that night, the fire was going to burn all night before the Romans could come through the gate. And during that night, about 1,000 Jews all committed suicide because they did not want to be taken by the Romans. But that's not what I'm trying to get at. It's on a great big hill. This building was built careful here. This building was built on a pretty good size hill, and the only way up was by a winding path like this. If you see a picture of Masada today, you can still see the walking path going up. This is not how you can attack a city with a Roman legion, or in this case, there were 3 Roman legions. And by the way, just in passing, what's the business about a legion? A legion was between 8,000 and 15,000 men, depending on if they had cavalry or not. And a legion was considered the size of an army big enough that they could pretty much fight any battle. In those years, a lot of the other people they were fighting were cities or areas that weren't, organized nations maybe, and they figured if they sent out one legion, that would pretty much pacify anything. And during the time of the Gospels and before AD 70, there was one legion that was assigned to the whole country of what we call today Israel. And it was enough. It was enough. But in the war, they had 3 legions. In fact, for a while, they had 4. Yeah. Because when the Romans decided to come down, they came down to once and for all, forever, stop these troublesome Jews. And that meant killing lots and lots of them. At any rate, Masada. When they got to Masada, the Romans set a camp with a wall all the way around the entire hill, and that's a job all by itself. And they were there a year altogether. A year for this one last place to make, and they were determined to get it and did. I'm taking too much time on this, but at any rate, I'll finish this and we'll move on. And they knew that they couldn't take it by going up that winding little path because it's pretty steep going up that way. So what they did is they said, we're going to build a dirt and rock ramp up one side. And if you see a picture of Masada today, the ramp can still be seen. It's still there. And they built this ramp that they could move a large machinery that would throw fireballs and this, that, and the other, or whatever, over the walls. But also, they could get close to that wooden gate with a covered, protected thing, and that's it when they could set the gate on fire. It took them about a year to build a ramp. It's huge, just the ramp going up the hill that was of an angle that they could move troops and move heavy things up that way. At any rate, they built the ramp, they got up there, and then under cover of their mobile thing, they set the gate on fire. And that night, the Jews had a big meeting and said, we're not going to have the Romans take us. We're going to kill ourselves. And it appears from what's been written afterward that there were actually 2 people inside that survived, a woman and a child. They both hid, and they weren't involved. So when the Romans came in the next day, the place was people laying everywhere dead, and they finally dug out this lady and the child and so on. Now, what about today? It's still there. When the Israeli army has a graduating class, in their army, their air force, whatever they have, their ceremony of these people being graduated and becoming full-fledged members of the Israeli army is held at Masada. That's how important it is to the Jews today. How about that? Okay, at any rate, why am I talking about all of this in connection with 1 John? Because AD 70 was a huge event in the history of the Jews. It changed all kinds of things. It changed how Jews and Christians related to each other. Now, Jews, we've studied before in the Gospels about Jews who became Christians, and then they were bringing in ideas from the Pharisees into the church. Remember Acts 15, the conference in Jerusalem, where they said that you've got to be circumcised if you're going to become a Christian. You've got to obey the law of Moses if you become a Christian, if a Gentile becomes a Christian. Okay? Well, these were Jewish people who had become Christians, and they were bringing their Jewish ideas into the church. A lot of that stopped after AD 70. Why? Because the Jews, it was so devastating of what happened with the destruction of the Jerusalem that the Jews simply had a lot of other things on their mind, like, first of all, survival. A fellow named Josephus, who was himself a Jew, wrote during the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. In fact, he traveled with the Emperor Vespasian, who was the commander of the armies. He was the commander of the armies before he became emperor, and then his son Titus, who later on became also emperor, ended the battle. But there were 2 generals of the Roman army during that time. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. Again, they were determined to kill the Jews. Josephus, who traveled with Vespasian and Titus, he knew both of those guys. They trusted him. He was an educated Jewish fellow. He wrote that 1,100,000 Jews died during that war. 1,100,000 Jews died during that war. Some people say maybe he exaggerated, but that's what Josephus said, and he was there when it happened. He traveled with the Roman army. A lot of people figure there were about 1.5 million Jews living in the land at that time. If that's true, then it would say that there were only 400,000 left out of 1.5 million. But Josephus also wrote that almost 100,000 of them were captured as slaves and became slaves, which could mean that there were only about 300,000 Jews left out of 1.5 million. Now, were there Jews living outside of that part of the country then in the first century? Oh, yeah. In Alexandria, Egypt, which is a big city then, it's still a pretty good-sized town today, there were thousands, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 Jews living in Alexandria. And there were Jews living in cities all over the Roman Empire. In fact, there's a little discussion about that in the New Testament. In Acts 18:2, it talks about how Claudius, an emperor in Rome in the 40s and 50s, had made all Jews leave Rome. Why, we don't know. And the why of that is not found in writing outside of the New Testament. But before the war even started in 66, sometimes the Romans had a really hard time with Jews. But the Romans killed a large number of these Jewish folks. And apparently, according to Josephus, about 100,000 of them became slaves. You ever heard of the word triumph? If we say that a basketball team triumphs, what do we mean? It means they win. That word comes back from when the Romans won a war. And the word triumph there didn't mean win, it meant a parade. Because when the Romans would win any real significant battle, they would have a huge parade of the troops coming back to Rome and of celebration. And it wasn't just celebration of winning the war. There are some records of one of these triumphs, parade, and day one was of all the loot that they had captured. And it took a day with the people on the sides cheering this, that, and the other, because the people were going to gain from this loot, gold or other things of value that they had been stolen, because the Roman government would use the loot to pay the soldiers, to reward the soldiers for their battle, but also would distribute it among the people of Rome. So everybody in the cheering crowd is expecting to get something out of day one, the loot. Number two was the army coming back. And the army would parade through on day two. And the people would cheer for all the army, many of whom were their family and relatives, glad to see them back, the ones who lived. And day three was the slaves. And some of these triumphs would be a day of the slaves coming into Rome. And apparently a large number of slaves came into Rome after the destruction of Jerusalem. And the people were also happy about this too. Why? Because slaves are property. They're worth money. What? Oh, they got them. Yeah, they won. But this was also like loot. It was value. They could divide the slaves up among the Romans or just sell them. And the government could use the money for the Roman citizens. Everything's good for the Romans with a triumph, you see. And that's where our word triumph comes from. There was a triumph when the Jews were destroyed, and they built an arch. It's called the Arch of Titus, because Titus was the guy who was in commander of the Roman army at the end of the battle, and he also became a Roman emperor. Yeah, I didn't know that, but yeah, and the Colosseum is huge. Yeah. This is not a little deal. It was a big deal. And the Romans achieved their purpose. The Jews were no longer going to be a trouble in the side of the Romans. But think of the Jews who were left. How do they feel after the destruction of Jerusalem? Think about every church building in the United States being destroyed to the ground. How would that affect us? You know, to the Jews, the temple was the place that they could worship God with animal sacrifices. And it was gone, like forever. And by the way, has there ever been animal sacrifices since then among the Jews? No, for 2,000 years. It ended, the animal sacrifices, apparently forever for the Jews. This was how they worshiped. This was out of the Old Testament. There was chapters and chapters in the Old Testament about how to do these sacrifices. And it's all gone forever. How do you feel about that if you're a Jew? They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to worship. They had a real serious problem of, who are we now? Our temple, our holy city that God says was the place where the temple should be built. It's not just the temple gone. The city was gone. And by the Temple Mount, it's a big flat area if you've ever seen pictures of that. It's today a great big flat area. For over 100 years after the destruction of the temple, that big flat area was a Roman legion camp. Jews were not allowed in the city or where the city was. In later years, they allowed Jews back in the country. They allowed Jews to come back into the city hundreds of years later. But for at least the first 100 years, it was a Roman legion camp. And Jews were not allowed anywhere around the city. How do we worship? What do we believe? What purpose do we have as a people anymore with the center of our faith destroyed? As I said, the Jews had bigger things on their minds than Christians. But did they have good feelings toward Christians then? Maybe not. And one reason why. Was the church in Jerusalem large? In the book of Acts it says at one point they had 5,000 and more. A lot of people think the church by the time of AD 70 had about 30,000 people. Just the church in Jerusalem. So did all those Christians die in the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple? No. Why didn't they die? Because they left town. They left town. If you read Matthew 24 and some of the other things that talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, it talks about Christians. Jesus talked about believers leaving when they saw the trouble getting near. And when the Christians in Jerusalem realized that the Roman armies were coming, and they didn't come by plane, folks, they walked, so they knew they were coming. They had time. The Christians left Jerusalem. We don't know how many there were, but it was thousands of Christians left Jerusalem. And they were all Jewish Christians, okay? But they didn't defend Jerusalem. They didn't defend the temple. So how do you think the Jews felt about them after AD 70? Not very friendly. Not connected anymore. Until about AD 70, to many people, Christians were a sect of Jews. You know what S-E-C-T means? Like the Pharisees, like the Sadducees, like another group that's not mentioned in the New Testament, the Essenes. A lot of people thought of the Christians that way. And it would appear that some Christians themselves may have continued going to the temple for worship because they hadn't really separated themselves completely from the ideas of Old Testament Judaism. And in fact, I believe, and numbers of people believe, that the book of Hebrews was written during the AD 60s, before the destruction of Jerusalem, to say to Jewish Christians, if the temple goes, your faith isn't lost, because your faith is not in the animal sacrifices. Your faith is not in the teachings of the Old Testament. Your faith is in what? Christ. And it's Christ's sacrifice that took away your sins, not the sacrifices at the temple. Many people think that Hebrews was written to prepare Jewish Christians for the destruction of Jerusalem so that they wouldn't be so disheartened when it happened. Because after all, they were Jews. Many of them lived in Jerusalem. It was their country. It was their people. But they had to separate all of that from their new Christian faith. And after AD 70, there wasn't such a problem about, do you have to become a Jew to become a Christian? That disappears. It's not found in the New Testament after that period of time. So at any rate, AD 70 is a big thing. Okay, so what happened between AD 70 and 100? We got about 10, 15 more minutes here. Well, partly because of everything I've just told you, there were not so many Jews down the line that were interested in becoming Christians. Christians didn't fight for Jerusalem. A lot of Jews weren't interested in hearing about Jesus. But who was interested? Gentiles, people who weren't Jews. And a lot more Gentiles became Christians. Evangelism in Palestine and what we call today Israel kind of ceased because the Romans just, took over everything. It was a blasted land. But Christians were growing in other parts of the Roman Empire. And this had started back, when Paul started teaching. He started teaching Gentiles and they became Christians and so on. But just like Jewish people, when they became Christians, sometimes brought into the church Jewish ideas, and that's what Acts 15 is all about, did you have to become a Jew when you become a Christian? As a lot more Gentiles became Christians, they started bringing into the church religious ideas that they had before they became Christians. And we're going to talk a good deal about Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a word that many Christians have never heard of and they have no idea what it means. Well, at the end of 1 John, you're going to have a better idea about what it means. But why have we not heard about it? Because, again, it came in mainly after AD 70. And we only have these few books. But 1 John is all about Gnosticism. It really is. And I'm going to show that to you. So the Gnostics, we've never heard of these folks. I'm going to give you a thumbnail of who the Gnostics were. First of all, they're being around. There's some indication and teaching against the Gnostics in the New Testament, in Colossians, in 1 John, and in a few other books. But the Gnostics themselves, they became a significant factor in the church, especially in the 2nd century, and pretty much died out by the 3rd century. Although there are still a few Gnostic groups that exist today and have existed since the 1st century, all the way through 2,000 years. I want to read this a little bit to you. Well, where can I find it? There's some folks in Iran and Iraq, and they have a name, and I had it here, and I didn't mark it, and I can't find it right now, but they have existed continuously over the last 2,000 years, and they're still Gnostics. But they're very, very small in both of those countries. The Muslim people don't like them, so they tend to persecute them also. The Gnostics had their own writings, and these were lost for many, many years. Christians wrote in the 2nd and 3rd century about Gnosticism against it, but we had never read their writings until in 1945, near a little Egyptian town called Nag Hammadi, little tiny town nobody's ever heard of before. They dug up a bunch of these writings that were all Gnostic writings. Now, 1945 is an important year, too. You want to know why? Well, they found these writings then, but what else happened in 1945? End of World War II. And something else important to me happened in 1945. That's when I was born. Okay? Hey, I've read a lot of books about World War II, and the World War in Europe ended a week before I was born. And there's books that talk about like the last days of the Nazis and so on, And I'm reading through these books, and it talks about what happened on May 10th and May 11th, 1945, and May 12th and May 13th and 14th, and May 15th. That's my birthday. That's when I was born. And I'm thinking, wow, that's the day I was born. And there's books that talk about what happened on May 15th, 1945. At any rate, since these writings were found, they were published. It wasn't published in English until 1977. And somewhere around 1980, I got a hold of this printed book about the writings of the Gnostics, and I read the book. Oh, my Lord, you would not want to read this book. First of all, it's so incredibly boring. I mean, like, oh, Lord. I mean, just plowing your way through these, just boring. And a lot of it's just rambling. And the Gnostics didn't all believe one thing. They had a whole great variety of beliefs. And sometimes from one page to the next, you'll find this teaching and then another teaching that kind of contradicts this teaching. And I read this book, and when I finished that book, I thought, I am never going to touch this stuff again. It was nonsense. It was silly nonsense. But at any rate, since 1977, when it came into English, it has influenced some folks. And I'm going to read to you the names of some religious groups. And I'll guarantee you, none of you have ever heard about these groups. But they are out there who are Christian-type people who believe in Gnosticism today. How about this? Ecclesia Gnostica, Johnite Church. Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica. That sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? It's the church of Catholics who came to believe in Gnostics. Thomasine Church, the Alexandrian Gnostic Church, and the North American College of Gnostic Bishops. Now, you've never heard of any of these folks before, and you never will again, because they're very, very tiny groups. But they are religious groups today that pretty much formed after 1945, and especially since 1977, when these writings of the Gnostics were first printed in English. Okay, at any rate, we're going to, if you got John, turn over to 1 John. And you don't need to look this up, because I'm just going to read a couple of verses, because John himself in 1 John talks about why he wrote. Three or four things that he says. The first one is in 1 John verses 3 and 4. 1 John chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. What we have seen and heard we proclaim to you also, that you also may have fellowship with us. And indeed our fellowship is with the Father and His Son, Jesus Christ. And these things write, so that our joy may be made complete. He says two things here in 1 John 1 as to why he wrote 1 John. The first one is that they can all have fellowship with each other. Christians can have fellowship, and that they can have joy. You see that? Okay. We're going to go to the next one. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. Why did John write 1 John? My little children, I am writing these things to you that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. So, what's the second reason he says why he wrote the book? So he won't sin. Says it in those words. Okay. Now there's one more. 1 John 5:13. 1 John 5:13. These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, in order that you may know you have eternal life. Pretty clear and simple, right? Okay, but why? Why did he say those three things as to why he was writing? Continued fellowship and joy, them not sinning, and assure them of that they could know they had salvation. Because there were people who were questioning all of these things. There were people who were saying that the people that were Gnostics should not be fellowshipping with Christians. There were people who were Gnostics that were saying that Christians could sin and it was okay. There were people who were Gnostics who were saying that they couldn't really know anything for sure unless the Gnostics taught them. That's why he says those three things of why he was writing in 1 John. All of this is concerning the Gnostic teachings. Now, even the Gospel of John itself, some people say was written to teach against Gnosticism. Now, the Gospel of John never talks about Gnosticism, and it's all presented positively. But in presenting things positively, John said some things that the Gnostics did not like and did not agree with. Let's go back to John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. So who's the Word? It's a person. He was in the beginning with God, the Word. Who is He? It's Jesus. And when did Jesus start? I don't mean it that way. Where does John 1:1 say Jesus was? In eternity, in the beginning. Now, where does that phrase "in the beginning" come from? Where did John pick up that phrase? The first verse in the whole Bible, Genesis 1:1. The first three words in Genesis 1 is "in the beginning." Well, what does that mean, in the beginning? In the beginning of everything. In the beginning of creation. Before the stars were made. Because that happens down in Genesis 1. In the beginning is Genesis 1:1. John picks up on that in his Gospel, chapter 1, verse 1, to say that in that beginning, Jesus was there. What's so important about that? Because the Gnostics said he wasn't there. In John 1:1, the Gospel, John is saying something that the Gnostics denied. Go down to verse 14. John chapter 1, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. What's the most significant word in that verse in our discussion right here? Flesh. Quit answering those questions, Nathan. Of course you do. Because some of the Gnostics said that Jesus never came in the flesh, that he was like a ghost, that he didn't have a real physical body. And in John 1:14, John says Jesus had flesh. That's why that word is there. Now turn over to 1 John 1:1. How about this, folks? Genesis 1:1, the Gospel of John 1:1, and now 1 John 1:1. What was heard from the beginning? 1 John starts out with the same phrase, in the beginning. What we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld, and our hands handled concerning the word of life. What's the word of life? Jesus again. And he says, we saw and we touched him. Why would that be there? Our hands touched him. Because some of the Gnostics said that Jesus was a ghost, that he wasn't a real human being. In a way, it's kind of a surprise. We're going to have to stop here in like 1 minute. Because in the Gospels, the big question was, who is this man? Is he God? But when the Gnostics came in, it reversed. It was, who is this God? Is he man? Was he really flesh? And some of the Gnostics answered that question, no, he wasn't flesh. But 1 John 1:1 starts out by saying, he was flesh. We saw him. We heard him. We touched him. He was flesh. Strange, isn't it, to think about someone teaching that way? Because who's teaching that today? Nobody. But it was a real problem when 1 John wrote 1 John. We got to stop. I knew we wouldn't get into 1 John 1:1.
Just a real quick comment.
Sure.
You covered it very well. I just want to make one statement that the Gospel of John, between the time of the Gospel of John and the first, when he wrote 1 John, the attitudes probably had changed. And you
Oh, yeah.
And First John, by the time they got there, they didn't believe he was a man. So it's reversed by that time.
Yeah.
And now they're questioning whether he was a man.
Yeah.
John knew that, and he addressed both of them similarly with opposite points of view of his audience because of the way the
Right.
in between them.
Remember I said Gnostics actually had a variety of beliefs? There was actually another view the Gnostics had besides that he was a god who was a ghost in the flesh, but not a real flesh person. They said that he was born a human, just an ordinary human with a mother and father, that Christ came into him at his baptism and left him just before he died on the cross. We're going to talk about that next week. So the Gnostics had a couple of ideas. All of them were wrong, of course, but they had different ideas among themselves about who Christ was. And 1 John addresses both of those ideas. If he was real flesh, and was he really God for his entire lifetime and even before he was born on earth. Okay, we got to stop. It's 10 till. Come back next week, and that's it. We're done.